and thus undercut public confidence in the election results. There was also no question that, in some areas, state rules meant to guard against fraud, for example, the requirement that voters file applications for mail-in ballots, were not followed. This also increased the opportunity for fraud. Still, the opportunity for fraud isn't evidence of fraud. Under our system, the states have responsibility for running elections. Claims that the election rules are not being followed fall under the state's jurisdiction, and the burden is on the complaining party to raise the matter with state officials and courts to have it addressed. This often requires pressing the states to conduct in-depth audits of relevant districts needed to resolve alleged irregularities. The Justice Department does not have the authority or the tools to perform that function. Instead, its role is to investigate specific and credible allegations of voting fraud for the purpose of criminal prosecution. A complaint just saying the rules were not followed is not enough. There must be some indication of actual fraud. When I looked at the voting patterns, it also appeared to me that President Trump had underperformed among certain Republican and independent voters in some key suburban areas in the swing states. He ran weaker in these areas than he had in 2016. It seemed this shortfall could explain the outcome. The fact that in many key areas Trump ran behind Republican candidates below him on the ballot suggested this conclusion and appeared inconsistent with the fraud narrative. As I had said in my confirmation hearing 2 years earlier, our country is deeply divided, but our saving grace is the ability to carry out the peaceful transfer of power through elections. If the American people lose confidence in the integrity of their elections and the legitimacy of an elected administration, we are headed toward a very dark place. That is why I was so disgusted by efforts in 2016 to delegitimize President Trump and resist his duly elected administration. But now the situation was completely reversed. It is one thing to say that the rules were unfairly skewed. It is another to say that the election's outcome was the result of fraud. President Trump's legal team was feeding his supporters a steady diet of sensational fraud claims without anything resembling substantiation. But if election results are going to be set aside on the grounds of fraud, it must be based on clear evidence, and it should be fraud of such magnitude as to be material to the outcome of the election. Proving fraud after the fact is exceptionally difficult, which makes it all the more important to have safeguards in place that prevent it from happening in the first instance. In the weeks after the election, accusations of major fraud centered on several claims. Allegations that counting machines from the Dominion Voting Systems Corporation had been rigged, that video footage from Fulton County, Georgia, showed a box of bogus ballots being insinuated into the vote count while poll watchers were absent, that massive numbers of ballots for Joe Biden had been inexplicitly dumped in the early morning hours in Detroit and Milwaukee, that thousands of votes in Nevada had been cast by non-residents, that more absentee ballots than had been requested were cast in Pennsylvania, and that a truck driver had delivered many thousands of filled-out ballots from Bethpage, Long Island to Pennsylvania. I had asked all the Department of Justice, DOJ, office heads around the country, working with the FBI, to look into these and a number of similar claims. Some turned out to be patently frivolous. Others just were not supported by the available evidence. I had repeatedly informed the president through his staff that the department was looking at substantial claims of fraud, but so far hadn't found them to have merit. For more than a week, I had been getting calls from Republican senators and members of Congress deeply concerned about the direction of things, especially the president's expanding his challenge from the courts to the state legislatures. They were concerned that if President Trump continued claiming he won the election without hard evidence, the country could be headed for a constitutional crisis. They wanted to know my thoughts on the fraud claims and asked if I could do something to inject more caution into the president's rhetoric about a stolen election. It was not lost on me that, with 2 Georgia runoff elections for senator coming up the first week in January, Republican senators still hoped for the president's help and could ill afford picking a public fight with him. On the other hand, as Attorney General, I uniquely had the ability to counteract the speculation and misinformation.